So, it's been a few months since I've picked the latent trauma that I have around Fire Emblem and the SRPG genre, and while this does mean that I'm becoming that which I hate, I'm gonna try to use this horrible feeling like I'm obligated to produce at least something about this particular part of the art world at least every now and then, and talk about the recent indie game Dark Deity, which came out to a crowd of pretty passionate fans of games they've name-dropped as inspirations, to some pretty interesting mixed receptions, with people calling it a knockoff Fire Emblem, both as praise and criticism. Now, there's more than a handful of people who have made topical, contemporary, timely content responding to it within its release period, as well as a decent number that took some time to get through the entire game and have a bit more of a comprehensive look at its strengths and weaknesses. And I've been trying to stay in the latter party, and by trying, I mean the game's pretty decently past its initial release, so I kind of have no choice in the matter. This video will likely not be, like, algorithm-friendly or whatever, but I'm here because I think there's something I can contribute to the grander conversation about the genre, about indie development, and while I have some particularly talented contemporaries? Am I allowed to call people with more subscribers contemporaries? Does this make me like a contemporary of H. Bomber? How does this term work? Anyway, a lot of weight is put in meeting the game at its stronger points, like namely the gameplay and mechanics. Now, long-term V fans, cat girl simps, I don't know what to call my audience, may remember a few months ago, I talked about mechanics and felt like I was back in time in my family's old house in Texas, trying to show off my culinary talent to my parents, who have been feeding me for, I don't know, at least several weeks by then, by putting, like, sugar packets into a cup of milk and presenting it to them like I've made hot cuisine. I'm not really here to talk about the nitty-gritty mechanics of Dark Deity, because other folks are better at it than me and are more passionate over, like, breaking the stuff down, and I prefer to respect that passion, and this also isn't a scathing takedown of the limitations a company of, what is it, like 6 people, something like that? Like an almost comically tiny development team have brought to their game. There are bugs, there's some graphical stuff, the music is a bit hit or miss, the visual design can be spotty in places, la-di-da. It turns out the company that doesn't have millions of dollars of gambling money can't give it the old Nintendo polish. So, what am I going to be talking about? Well, writing. I know that, judging by these videos, that's a bold claim for me to make, because what the fuck do I know about writing? But before I get into it, I want to make a few things clear. I like Dark Deity. It's not just fun for an indie game, it's a pretty solidly fun game. It scratches the party-building customization itch that I crave, and at its best, it can feel great to play. Like, getting past the glitches and the bugs here and there, the game is fun. The characters can be fun, the bonds are amusing, it's all a perfectly competent showing, which is kind of huge considering the company that released it. Like this is in no way me going in on saying the game is bad or trashing it. I just wish that of the many things the team cared about, writing was one of them. So again, Dark Deity is overall a pretty competent showing considering all the context at play. Great, and that extends to the baseline of the story, right? Like, the premise is simple enough. Irving, the protagonist, and his 3 friends are at a military academy when the king drafts them into the ongoing war. You start out by helping some folks along the way, get into some conflicts here and there, until a man who is looking for these things called eternal aspects shows up. You're interrupted by these 3 girls, who explain that the man who looks like a villain is in fact a villain, and you learn about the importance of these aspects, right? You band together with Sarah, one of the girls, and amass an army to collect the aspects and protect them from the bad guys. This leads to Irving defecting from the army, to watching his brother die, to going on an adventure to collect more aspects, fight the bad guy, stop the next calamity, overthrow the bad king on your way. It's all pretty standard fare for the genre, especially for a product name-dropping Fire Emblem in their inspirations. I'm hardly unique in pointing this out. It doesn't take some kind of elitist art snob to point out that the story is pretty middling and par for the course, but there are elements at play in Dark Deity that make this matter complicated, and in order to do that,
how can I help?
Surprise, surprise, I'm gonna have to talk about mechanics, my favorite thing. Yeah. Okay, So how do we start with this? Permadeath, as a concept, is pretty alive and well in the SRPG genre, though that's mostly due to it being a core tenet of the FE series. It's also in Final Fantasy Tactics, the other listed inspiration for Dark Deity, and Deity here has done their own spin on it. No permadeath. No one in your army can die. Like their health can reach 0, but they'll be deployable in the next map, and losing all your HP only nets a 10% reduction in a random stat. That, mechanically, is a clever concept because it bypasses a pretty significant inter-fandom debate on, say, Fire Emblem, about whether or not you're playing the game as intended by resetting to avoid permadeath. On the mechanics side, this move encourages players to play through mistakes, which are almost assured to happen considering that, critical hit chances have no reduction whatsoever, so you're going to reach the latter half of the game with enemies sporting beefy attack and beefy critical hit chances. Death is just going to happen. Now, I have some mild criticisms of the system on its face, in that reducing important stats for your best units can leave you wholly underpowered as the story continues, and it can feel a little bit like you've lost overall capacity to complete the game due to sheer lack of viable combat threats you can bring into the table, but I got another thing up my sleeve here. It's a small issue, by no means a deal breaker, but the game's narrative continues on, talking about the harsh realities of war and the likelihood of the character's death at any time. And I want to try to unpack this tiny little element here, because it's not unusual for games to bring up the grim realities of potential death in high-risk situations, like wars, revolutions, etc., while mechanically not giving you that option without it, prompting a game over screen. But it is weird here. The units, when they fall, all have the stylings of a death quote from Fire Emblem, where a character will lament their fate as they leave the game forever, pending a reset or the use of in-game rewind functions, but with none of the mechanical consequences. This element, by evoking the stylistic similarities of FE, feels like a disconnect. Like they wanted to wink and nod at the series that inspired them without the kind of weight even the looming threat of an in-game loss could support. Again, this particular element by itself is by no means a substantial problem, it's just emblematic, of the tone the game seems to take with the trappings and conventions of the genre. The game does care a lot about its own writing, right? Like it's not so shallow that they just transparently don't care. There's a lot of world building tucked away in the bond supports, things about the Exiled, Aramor, Delia, the Calamity, the First Order, how dwarves come to play. Like there's a genuine effort into making the place feel full, and that's great. But if you're a regular on my tiny little corner of the internet, you know that I'm not the biggest lore fan. Like, you can have good lore for all sorts of things, but if the experience of engaging with the story directly doesn't hold up, I don't really care how neat the lore is. If you do, great, but it doesn't change what I see as interesting issues that come up in examining how Dark Deity goes about telling the story. So, honestly, when I first went through the story, as much as there were a lot of signals, in-jokes, lampshades, etc. on the Fire Emblem series woven into the narrative, item descriptions, Faust, I didn't actually really feel like I was playing Fire Emblem from a narrative lens. It actually felt a little more like Luminous Arc, which is interesting. Luminous Arc is a weirdly horny anime SRPG that no one cares, do they? Like, was Luminous Arc popular? I don't know, Atlas published it? I don't know. It's a game where a small band of children, raised for a military purpose, are sent on a mission by the theocracy to purge all witches from the land. Problem, the witches are good, actually, and help maintain the balance of the spiritual, natural world, and the church is, in fact, bad. Your party has to learn this over a few fraud encounters, blah blah blah. You revolt against the hand that fed you, turn to the good side, raise a tiny army of witches and sex freaks, and attack and dethrone God. And minus the errant, irresponsible horniness of Luminous Arc, there are a lot of beats that happen in similar ways in Dark Deity, complete with a kind of obvious setup and reveal. Varric, the King of Delia, we're back to talking about Dark Deity, try to keep up. It's revealed to be kind of a prick, like really early on in the story, and that he's introduced as starting a war for an inexplicable reason. threatening to brand you traitors because you had the gall to help some villagers on the way to the capital, and forces you to execute deserters to prove your loyalty. The actual problem in Dark Deity is one that threatens the balance and stability of the entire world, so marching over Varric's weird drive for conquest is kind of an incidental stepping stone on the road to the main villain, who, you know, conveniently enough has been assisting Varric, and that convenience is kind of what I wanted to bring up. So,
it will be done.
Dramatic convenience. As a concept, despite being the primary target of the naturalism movement in theater history, no one cares about this either. Okay, look, it's fine to have dramatic convenience. It's fine for the train to be delayed just in time for a tearful confession, or to have a villain be a part of the B-plot the whole time. Like, dramatic convenience is a perfectly fine thing to have in your story. Most stories these days have some element of convenient timing, and I don't care how many times CinemaSins gets haughty about it, it's fine. However, it can be kind of unsatisfying in a story constructed mostly through narrative dramatic convenience, and Dark Deity kind of falls into that territory from time to time. Let's take, for example, Chapter 23. Okay, so, Chapter 23. The army has started to fight back against the oppressive Delian army. Up to this point, they've been harassing the citizenry, imprisoning the families of folks in your army, they've burned Irving's village to the ground because of reasons, and now you're working to make a further push to the capital, and Sloane, this is Sloane, insists that you have to kill her father. Now that's an interesting plot point, like asking the army to kill your own father? With all these chapters, like, this must be something well established and a long time coming. No. Well, maybe. Like, if you got the right Bond conversations with Sloane leading up to this, you get to hear bits and pieces about her life with her father, how she was treated, how she felt. But that's both if you're using Sloane regularly, and if you're using her in the same team as the right folks to talk about her father, since not every Bond support she has is about her father, which is a good thing. You know, the Bond conversations can actually be, you know, pretty good from time to time. This plot point can kind of come out of nowhere. However, the way it's presented in the story carries the finale of a narrative arc. He's a boss, like one of the few bosses in the game. There's a lot of screen time devoted to Sloane and Irving discussing this, how the rest of the group has been treating her, but all of this culminates in what? Like, she assures Irving over and over that she wants this. Her father is bad. He needs to be killed. She feels no remorse, so it's this big sort of heavy emotional beat, but it has no grounding. We don't really know that much about what has pushed her to so callously require him to die. I mean, she suggests it, like, pretty readily, and that's kind of the big tone problem going through all of Dark Deity. Lincoln is a faithful knight in service of the king, and he swaps sides at Irving's decision with only mild hesitation. Vestra is part of the First Order, who's supposed to be the most well-kept secret organization in the world, and yet disclosing everything to Irving within the same chapter we meet her doesn't really have substantive consequences. Irving has this anxious build-up over meeting with his father again, but it's fine. His father's a nice, supportive, good man. The village was burned down? It's okay. Esme, Irving's mother, is alive, and we've been told she's tough, so, you know, that's all good. Like the little detail about how permadeath is teased about in the character dialogue, a lot of the beat-by-beat points of the story have all the aesthetic trappings of a weighty, thoughtful narrative, but with little to none of the structure that supports it. And, you know, judging by its inspirations, having a well-written story is by no means a necessity. I mean, hell, Fire Emblem's been struggling with that one for, maybe ever? Not every story can, or should, be like Final Fantasy Tactics. Big and sweeping and also close and intimate and, you know, it's good. Hot take. Final Fantasy Tactics, good game. Who'd have thought? But I want to make a couple of comparisons, and this brings me back to my initial hesitations. I do not want to come across as someone complaining that this tiny studio wasn't able to make something as polished and neat as a game made by a major company. This is my attempt at a good faith breakdown of the kinds of writing pitfalls this game falls into. And if I'm going to be uncouth and draw comparisons, I'm not going to go for titles known for having stronger narratives, so like no FFT, no Genealogy, no Tellius Era, Fire Emblem. Let's pick something I don't see folks talk a lot about. Let's do Blazing Sword. So, I bring up Blazing Sword because it's basically the one that I can recount offhand by memory, and I'm lazy, as well as it being kind of a fine story. Like, there's not a whole lot egregiously bad about it, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a gem of storytelling. The first part of the game largely has nothing to do with the main plot, so much so that in the course of going through the main plot, the first main character you're introduced to basically has no reason to be here outside of solidarity. Like, her friends are important to her, so here she is. So, I'm actually going to start the comparison with Elowood's story, the one that's, like, unlocked at the start. Okay, see, what makes Elowood's story as solid as it is isn't that hard to figure out. It's not a dense, complicated thing. It just knows how to build from a boy searching for his dad to a boy wielding a legendary blade to destroy a mad druid and a giant dragon, step by step. So, Elowood searches for his dad, finds clues that take him from battle to battle, finding allies new and old. They uncover a plot his dad is wound up in, go to confront the mastermind behind it. The mastermind kills Elowood's father and threatens to reignite the Scouring, an ancient war that nearly wiped out life as we know it. Elowood's dad begs him to stop Nurgle, the mastermind, with his dying breath. We go on a journey to find the resources needed to kill dragons, if it comes to that. Elowood loses someone else to Nurgle's manipulations. We go back to the island, find him, stop him, he releases the dragons. We get an 11th hour revival of the girl Elowood kills, who stops the gate from opening fully. We clean up a dragon. The end. So why this is important to look at as a point of comparison is to kind of highlight the troubles we run into with plot cohesion in Dark Deity. Elowood wants to find his father, that's the opening objective, and it's one that he's personally invested in, obviously. Each step of the journey reveals something new about what his father's been up to, something about a rebellion, something about this shadowy group of assassins, until it culminates in the change of objective when his father is found and killed almost right after. In contrast, Dark Deity's plot is kind of expedient for its own sake. We decide to stop bandits because it's a morally good thing to do. The only good bandit's a dead bandit. That leads us to this house, where we learn about one of the main villains and about the eternal aspects. Fine. The next point of progression is the king forcing us into a combat situation to prove our loyalty, then it's a mission to fight Aramor, and then before we can really get into that, the princess who we ran into before has arrived and goes, we need you to come with us because it's important and has to do with the aspects, and Irving just does. There's a bit of commentary about disappointing his brother Sterling, who's also in the army, but it's a decision that's approached and decided on then and there. Whoops, we're defectors now. And no one, even though most of your army has signed up with some kind of profound loyalty to the king and the country, is dissuaded. And the reason is kind of probably because the writers knew ahead of time that the king is bad, and the fiction isn't about a group of diverse people with tense, conflicting ideologies, as much as it's a group of good people with sound moral judgment. In short, the cast is largely untouched by the issues presented in the game's story. Short the death of Irving's brother via magic blast that inexplicably turned Irving's hair black, most of the issues in the game are either resolved on the spot, or they kind of just slide off the cast. At one point, Elias, who had been mostly silent for a majority of the game, was apparently tasked with trying to uncover one of the big bads that had escaped into this curse's staff, and he brought up that this was putting him at risk, but the solution was... what? To head out into the astral plane anyway? Like there's just a flimsiness to show how the story moves point by point that, when paired with a lot of its tongue-in-cheek delivery, creates the idea that this isn't a story meant to be seriously engaged with. It's snarky, meme-filled. Field? What? Almost like a satire of its own genre. Except it's not. Look, there is an undeniable amount of ironic distance in the writing of this game, but if we try and take this as a sign that the entire game is supposed to be lighthearted, easygoing, memey fun, that kind of doesn't work either. The game lives in Purgatory, a little too facile and insincere to be taken on its face as a genuine story about these characters and their conflicts, and a little too serious and straightforward to really be a potent satire of the genre. The characters have their own personal depth to them, sure, but none of that really manages to weigh in on the plot. The stakes are telegraphed narratively to be high, but the reality of playing it removes said stakes. Even if stat reductions really did threaten to render your army incapable of proceeding, I think the next solution would beat a reset anyway, kind of defeating the purpose of removing permadeath as a mechanic. The game's overall tone puts it in a place where you can see the care and passion and thought in the mechanics, in how the game feels to play, how they wanted to emphasize party building, character customization, how they wanted each map to have a push and pull where it can feel evocative of the genre, while distinct enough to have its own identity, and that creativity, that passion didn't seem to make its way into the writing in a substantial way. You can see the effort put into the lore of the world, the identity of the characters, the world building, but the resulting story, the thing you're engaging with to help provide the context of why you're playing all of these levels, just comes off as generic and substanceless. I spent a lot of time comparing this game to Fire Emblem, and I hope you all know how guilty I feel about doing so, but I'm gonna make the point that Dark Deity is not Fire Emblem, and that's true in a lot of ways, but I want to highlight that it isn't Fire Emblem, and that's a good thing. Fire Emblem is made by Intelligent Systems, and it's an exclusive Nintendo property. That means that no matter how much it helps to fill the cavernous void within me, because I cannot focus on things to save my life, and I need something to stimulate my brain that's seemingly full of radio static, and my psychiatrist keeps insisting that I can't have ADHD because I graduated from college. I'm getting off topic. Look, Fire Emblem is art made by a corporation. That doesn't make it less art by any means, but it's art with a lot of oversight. Like, a Fire Emblem title must fit within the boundaries of what Nintendo and Intelligent Systems would deem acceptable. Like, there are things the games cannot touch on, cannot approach, or change because the publishers and the producers all need to agree that what goes into the game will turn a profit. Dark Deity is not Fire Emblem. This company doesn't have to appeal to Nintendo's business sense in order to release their game, which means that they have the freedom to explore this genre in ways that their inspirations kind of can't, and that's incredible. I can't program games, I can't draw to save my life, but I wish I had the liberty to explore the genre through a narrative lens, because there's a lot to be done to complicate and challenge what a lot of us take at face value. And if, by some small miracle, the folks over at Sword & Axe LLC are watching this anxious mess of a video, I just want to say that I think Dark Deity is a pretty solid initial release. There's a lot of talent on display, and I am genuinely looking forward to their next project. I just feel like there could be a broad perspective on games as a whole, especially in game genres that tend to focus on the mechanics more than anything else, that writing is just not a priority. And I get why that perception exists. I'd hardly say that FFTA2's, that's Final Fantasy Tactics Advance 2, which is the third game in this, that game's story, like, I wouldn't call it deep, complex, and engaging on its own. I play FFTA2 because I like the battle system. I like playing Shadows of Valentia, not because I personally enjoy watching the game be that kind of, like, old-school, fair-made sexist to pretty much every woman in the game, but because the style and presentation of it is just genuinely compelling and pleasant. I know you don't need a good story to have a good game, but just as much as a project surviving on its mechanics alone, genuinely focusing on telling an engaging story can truly elevate a piece of art. Thracia and Genealogy are kind of mechanically frustrating. I don't really care much for their mechanics, but I cannot help but find the narrative compelling. And more than that, there are games out there, some of which I've already talked about on this channel, who can tell stories that stay with us, that we connect to personally, that have this beautiful synergy with the gameplay, the aesthetics, that it feels more whole, more connected and thoughtful. It's just worth thinking about how a game tells its story. Special thanks to Brandon Haney, Kate Rose, Colleen T, D.R. Baker, Dector A, Evan Kearns, Lewis Wells, Maria Aladren, Alistair V, Narai the Redmarked, Pahor, Herr Bopper Professor Mr. Bopper Bopper Man, and Thomas Vulpes. Please don't be mad at me, Dark Deity. I like your game a lot, and I just want it to be a little better.